My name's Michael Santos. I'm the founder of Prison Professors, and I started that really nonprofit because I was in prison serving a 45-year prison term. Although I live in Southern California right now, the reality is I started in a background that probably should have never led me to prison. I grew up in North Seattle, a community called Lake Forest Park on the north end of Lake Washington. I had every opportunity to lead a normal life, but when I was about 20 years old, I saw the movie Scarface, and it put me on a bad path. My father had escaped from Cuba, and actually I still remember driving down the road and hearing that story of Tony Montana talking on the radio. I said, that dude sounds like a Cuban. It sounded like my father. So I wanted to go see the movie, really not knowing what it was about. I wasn't a drug user, but I was so enthralled by the movie. Hot chicks, fast cars, super fun life. And I thought, that sounds like something I want to do. But I didn't know anything. I didn't use drugs, but I knew people who used cocaine. So I started reaching out to people I knew who used cocaine, and I'd say, well, if you use cocaine, isn't it logical that you bought cocaine from somebody? And they said, sure. I said, well, do me a favor, find out what it costs. And I mean, this is all the wisdom of a 20-year-old. That's how old I was back in 1984, 85 when this began. And I learned the price of a kilogram back then in North Seattle was, as I recall it, somewhere in the $50,000 range. So I made a phone call to some of the guys, the children of other people that my father escaped Cuba from. Well, his name was Tony in Miami. And I said, Tony, you live in Miami, you went to high school in Miami, you must know somebody who sells cocaine. He said, sure. I said, find out how much does a kilogram of cocaine cost? And he comes back to me and he says, it's like $20,000. And, just do some simple math. And I said, God, I could buy it for $20,000. People are paying up here in Seattle north of $50,000. There's an opportunity here. But of course, I didn't want to do it myself because I knew it was against the law. This is really before the war on drugs. Ronald Reagan is in the White House, to give you some context of time. And I started asking some of my friends. I said, well, if I pay you $5,000, would you fly to Miami, drive home with your girl, and traffic this cocaine with you and bring it back to North Seattle? And I found people who would do it. So that's how I kind of got started, but I also needed the money. So I told my father a lie that I was going to help help him with his construction business, buying construction equipment that was from a company that was going out of business. And I said, I need to take some cash because I want to make a cash offer. My whole mindset was I could take this money from my father, buy the cocaine in Miami, bring it back to Seattle, have it sold, put the money back in my dad's account, and all be well. I mean, if you were going to make $30,000 a kilo, that was the goal. I didn't realize that what I was really doing was making myself into a much more serious crime than if I were doing it myself. I was putting myself in the role of a kingpin. So that transaction worked out well. I made a few $100,000 as a 20-year-old, which was all the money in the world, and put the money back in my dad's account, and then really just scaled from there and continued doing that from the time I was 20 until the time I was 22 or so. People started to get arrested. They started to cooperate against me. I went to, hired an attorney. He told me, he said, yeah, there's an investigation going that's on, but you're not yet a target. But I didn't want to stick around to be a target. So I moved to the south of Spain in a community called Marbella, and I started making my life there for several months. But when you're living in Marbella, you kind of miss the United States. I didn't even speak Spanish, so it was hard for me to assimilate there. So I called the attorney and I said, has there been anything going on this case of mine? The attorney says, no, I haven't heard anything. So I decided to come back to the United States in August of 1987 after being gone for several months. And it wasn't long thereafter that DEA agents came and pointed the gun at my face and said, are you Michael Santos? I said, I am. He said, you're under arrest. And that was the first wake-up call that I've created a very big problem for myself. They told me I was facing life in prison. I didn't understand what that meant. All I knew is that I didn't get caught with any cocaine. I didn't get caught there were no telephone calls with me on there. They didn't find any money around me. I was living a lifestyle that I couldn't explain, but I really wanted to believe that I could get out of this. And I had an attorney who was telling me what I wanted to hear rather than what I needed to hear. What I needed to hear was, you've made some really bad decisions in your life and you're facing a serious crime, a serious sentence, and you should accept responsibility and try and make amends. But I wasn't getting that guidance from my attorney, and so he was telling me what I wanted to hear, and I decided, great, then let's go to trial. But I was locked in that first year. They never let me out on bail after that arrest, so I'm locked in solitary confinement. And I'd never been in custody before. So, I was 23 years old. I didn't understand. I didn't get an opportunity to talk with other people in jail because I'm in the hole. And this is what I thought prison was going to be like. And my lawyer just keeps telling me there's a big difference between an indictment and a conviction. But anybody who's experienced the federal system will later learn there's not a big difference between an indictment and a conviction. When you get charged with a crime in the federal system, you are genuinely, good chance you're going to face a sentencing hearing. But I didn't understand that, and I really wanted to believe that I would walk out of here. Well, it didn't turn out that way. After about 5 or 6 months, I went to trial. Several people with whom I was pretty close testified against me and said that I had put this scheme together to traffic in cocaine, where I would hire people that would fly down to Miami, drive it across country, distribute it to people, store it. So I was really in my mindset that if I didn't do anything, if I didn't touch it myself, I wasn't breaking the law. But the crime that I was convicted of and charged with was called 848, a continuing criminal enterprise. And it carried a possible sentence of life in prison. So while going through a trial that lasted about a month, where scores of people testified against me, I just dug myself deeper. I mean, I took the witness stand and said I didn't do it. The jury saw through it all and convicted me of every count. And it was that moment that really my life began to change, because when the marshals locked me in cuffs this time, I knew I wasn't getting out of prison. And I went back to the jail, and I'm in solitary confinement. And there was an officer that I wish I could thank, because he really is the one that changed my life. He'd known me for several months while I was in the cell, and he came to me, and I remember him leaning against the window and just said, "How did it go?" And I said, "It really didn't go very well. I was convicted of every count, and now I'm facing life in prison." And he said to me, "I've got something that I think can help you." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "I'm going to bring you a book." And it's amazing how a book can change your life. And this was a book about Frederick Douglass. I didn't know who Frederick Douglass was, but he was a guy who was born during the era of slavery. And he didn't know any life other than being a slave. And he lived in that way for 20 years until he escaped. And this was a message that I got out of that book, is that when Frederick Douglass escaped, he didn't go on to lead his own life and be free. Instead, he wanted to try and change the world. And to do that, he had to learn how to read, he had to learn how to write, and he had to learn how to communicate really well. And that is really what led him to becoming one of the most influential abolitionists, as led to the abolition of slavery. So I remember getting inspired by that. And then his name was Officer Wilson, that's all I know of him, brought me another book, and it was Plato's Republic. And I had been a terrible student in school, but when you're in the hole for a long period of time, that's your only form of communication, your only form of connection to the world. And I'm reading this Plato's Republic, and it started off with this story called the Crito, of Socrates being in jail. And he's facing death for the crime of wanting to teach other people. And I thought that was a noble thing, that Socrates really believed that every person had the right to try and become better. It was just in his society, it was against the law from people from one class to teach another. So he broke the law, he went to trial, he was convicted, and he was facing death. But the leaders didn't really want to carry it through. And his buddy, his name was Crito, came to see Socrates in jail, and he said to him, don't worry about it. We're going to let you, I've already worked it out with the jailer. Your friends are going to support you in exile. You're going to walk out of here tonight, and you can go on to live your life in peace. And Socrates said, "No, I'm going to stay." And his friend Crito said, "What do you mean you're going to stay? If you stay, you're going to die." And Socrates said, yes, I'm going to die. And he said, why would you do that? And he said, well, I live in a democracy. In a democracy, I've got to take the good with the bad. And this is a bad law. But I broke the law, and I would rather die with my dignity intact than run away like a coward for problems that I created. This society has clothed me and fed me and protected me from foreign enemies, and I have the right to change laws I don't agree with. I don't have the right to break laws. And I'll just say it was the combination of Frederick Douglass and Socrates that changed my life. I remember putting the book on my chest and lying back in that cell and just kind of staring as you're feeling the pressure of the walls and the ceiling closing in. I haven't been sentenced yet. I'm facing life in prison. And thinking to myself, is there some kind of way that I could make sense out of whatever's going to come? And what was going to come was a sentence that it would be no less than 10 years and possibly life. And I thought, yeah, there probably is. People who are familiar with Socrates may be familiar with this concept of Socratic questioning and asking questions. And while I was sitting in that cell thinking about what was coming, I started to think about, well, people, I would imagine like your viewers who are just law-abiding citizens, people who don't understand what it's like to go to prison. I thought, is there anything that I could do while I'm in here? Anything that would cause the world to see me not as a coke trafficker, but rather, how do I respond to this? And how do I make amends and reconcile with society? And I said, well, the answer is probably yes. There is probably something that we could do, but what is it? And I didn't know the answer to that because the staff in a jail setting is basically telling you, if you can't do the crime, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. And I didn't understand what it would be like, but I wasn't thinking so much about my immediate environment. I was thinking about the world to which I wanted to return. And I thought, well, what would the people that are going to have influence on my life expect from me? And I came across with this like three-pronged approach that it was going to guide me through prison. And one, I think the people I'm going to meet that might have influence over my life, they would want me to show I don't want to be a criminal anymore. And one way I could do that would be to get an education. And that became super important to me. I said, I'm going to find a way to get an education while I'm in custody. And the second would be to find a way to contribute to society in some kind of meaningful, measurable way. And the third would be I would have to build a support system, a group of people that would believe in me. And if I could do that, I hoped that my journey through prison, whatever length of time it was going to be, would help me, would give me a chance to come back to society strong with my dignity intact and opportunities to build a life, even though I'm going to be in prison for all of my 20s, all of my 30s, all of my 40s. I didn't even know how long it was at that time. I just knew I was going to be in prison for a long time. And I got so inspired. And, this was inspired by the story of Frederick Douglass and Socrates. I can't say I did it myself. I was really inspired by those people. And so I remember getting up and, you're in a solitary cell and I'm sitting on this little concrete bunk and I write a letter to the newspaper who'd been covering my trial and saying, I made a lot of bad decisions. I went to trial. I denied what I had done. The government had been pressuring me to cooperate against others, but I wasn't on that path. I was just, already convicted. There was no getting out of jail at this point. But I said, maybe I could do something to make better. Maybe I could draw a line in the sand. And I told the journalist, if you want to know the story of what happened, come see me. And that led to a journalist coming to visit me. And I told them that I had deep regrets for the bad decisions that I had made. And I was going to find a way to emulate the adjustment of Frederick Douglass or what I learned from Socrates. And when I got to prison, this is what I was going to do, is to find a way to make it better. And, when somebody hears that kind of story, I think that it starts with a level of cynicism that something can happen. And I accepted that. And that's certainly what happened when I went to sentencing. Because a few months later, I went to the sentencing hearing, and I'll always remember the judge reading that article because it came out top of the fold in the newspaper, and the judge read it before I imposed sentence. And the prosecutor got up, and I'll always remember what he said, that he said, Michael Santos says he's going to change his life while he's in custody. But, the United States feels that if he spends every day of his life in an all-consuming effort to repay society or to reconcile with society, we believe that even if he lives to be 300 years old, our society will be at a significant net loss. And it was kind of harsh to hear that at the time, but it was also the world in which I lived. You go into the criminal justice system, and it is designed to obliterate hope and to tell you that you've got nothing coming at all. And I felt that was helpful to me to get that kind of news, because it prepared me for really what was coming. And the marshals, locked me in handcuffs and shackles and led me through the system that takes you into the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And I was convicted in Seattle, but they transferred me to a high security penitentiary in Atlanta. And at that time, the prison system was much smaller. There were only about 30,000 people in prison in the mid-1980s. But this was the era of the war on drugs, and things were changing. And you had Nancy Reagan making statements on television about just say no, and Ronald Reagan saying that drugs were one of the biggest problems in society, and the only way to respond to it was through lengthy sentences. So my judge sentenced me to 45 years in federal prison with no parole. But because I had been in the hole for the first year, I didn't even really know what that meant. I didn't know, am I going to be in prison for 45 years? And that was kind of hard to conceive because I hadn't been alive that long. But when I got to the penitentiary, it was very different. It was the most violent federal prison in the nation at the time. And, there was a lot of tension there. But when I got there, it was, to me, an amazing piece of liberty, because I'd been in the hole for a year. And there was a 40-foot wall that went around the prison. So I could see, horizontally, but you can't see over the wall. So it is somewhat confining. The one thing that I could see is up, and I could see the blue sky, and I could breathe fresh air, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a literal sense, because when you're in the hole, you don't have fresh air. So breathing fresh air and seeing the blue sky really gave me hope. And that's what I think is so important for people who are living in a crisis, is to believe and to see you can become something more. I'd love to say those are my own words, but that's what I learned from these people I read about. And I continued reading about people who had gone through struggle and challenges, and it really helped me realize there's going to be a way through this. But it's not going to be by accident, and it's not going to be by happy talk and talking about what somebody else is going to do for me. It's going to be something, what can I do? And because I'd never been incarcerated before, I didn't even know how the system was organized. I went to a high security penitentiary. I just thought that's what prison was like. But you start hearing these messages about how to serve time, and was really important during that first 30 days of time in prison before I went to what's called a team meeting, and you meet with staff. And I'm hearing from guys in prison who are telling me, the way to survive in here is to have a real ball of hate in your stomach and a knife. And sure, that's the way to survive if you want to live in prison and if you want this kind of life. But by then I'd been incarcerated for a year, and I hated every second of it. I'd lost everything that I had previously taken for granted. And I knew I wanted to get out, and at some point get out and build a life that would lead to something better. And so it was through that process that I started to hear about the prison system is divided. There's high security penitentiaries and medium securities and low securities and minimum securities. And I'd heard this from the other guys I was serving time with. So finally I go to this team meeting where I'm meeting with a case manager and a counselor and a unit manager. And I've got my plan of how I'm going to get through this. And I remember asking them, I've heard about these things called federal correctional institutions and lower security prisons. I said, is there any chance of me being able to transfer to one of those prisons? And I'll always remember the unit manager telling me, he said, you've been convicted of an 848, you're a drug kingpin, and a federal judge sentenced you to 45 years. He said, this is exactly where you're supposed to be, and you'll be in this environment until you get out. And, I didn't really understand what that meant, but I understood that I'm in an environment where I'm going to be for a long time, and I didn't know how to process it. I'd heard by then about good time, and I could finish the sentence in 26 years, because I was convicted under a law that the sentencing laws have changed since 1987. Now, there's less good time, but at that time, if you avoided disciplinary infractions, you would get credit, what's called good behavior. And I learned I could satisfy the sentence in 26 years. So I didn't even know what that meant because I hadn't lived for 26 years. And to put that perspective, we're filming this in 26 years. You're looking at 2051, 2052. How do you stay strong while you're going through that period of time? And I didn't know the answer to that, but I did have that plan that I got from Socrates. And that's, don't think about where I am right now. Think about how I want to get out of here. And just as I did in the solitary cells, take a pencil and start writing letters, I start writing letters to universities because that was the first plan. I've got to demonstrate I don't want to be a criminal. And it's kind of hard to do in a high security penitentiary where there's a tremendous amount of pressure all the time. But if you've got a plan, you can architect a strategy. So my plan was to, first of all, I've got to focus on getting an education. I really wanted to penetrate those 40-foot walls, but the only way I could get onto the other side would be if I could learn how to put words into sentences and sentences into paragraphs and connect with people. And I didn't know how to do that because I'd been such a terrible student in high school. So I start writing to universities, and basically, my name is Michael Santos. I'm in prison. I made really bad decisions, but I really want to be better. Is there any chance of going to school? And you send one letter out, you're probably not going to get a response. You send 10 letters out, I'll always say you got a 10 times better chance of not getting a response. But if you could send out 100 letters, if you could really try to connect with the world, somebody's going to respond. And I was very fortunate when I connected with a university that said, okay, we want you to give you a chance. And I got enrolled in school and they sent me books. And I remember when I got those books within the first couple of months of getting to the pen, all of a sudden I didn't feel as if I was a prisoner anymore. Now I was a student and I was building my path and pursued that path of working toward an undergraduate degree. And as I got closer to getting that degree, I wanted to go to law school. And I started writing to law schools and making that same statement. I've been in prison for a long time. I'm about to get my undergraduate degree and I want to continue with my education. It was always a pathway that I believed would help me put me on the pathway to new opportunities. So the law schools all wrote me back and said, the American Bar Association will not allow us to grant a degree to somebody who's not on campus and studying on campus. But maybe one of them, Hofstra Law School in New York, wrote me back and said, well, you can't get to law school, but maybe we could do we have more flexibility with a graduate degree, and what would you want to study? And my whole message was, I really think this concept of mass incarceration is one of the great social injustices of our time, and it really afflicts, poor people and people of color more than anyone else, and I want to have a role in trying to change that. And they were receptive to that message and allowed me to start working toward a master's degree. And I studied the prison system and the people that hold. So I was really kind of like you, Mark, in the sense that you get to be an ethnographer and tell people's stories in their own words. And so I started to interview other people in prison and write their stories and then use them to teach in universities. So I'd start sending them out to professors. And I built this, you might remember that earlier I said Frederick Douglas or Socrates inspired me to come up with this plan of getting an education, contributing to society, and building a support network. Well, that's kind of hard to get off the ground, but once you get started, you find it starts getting momentum. And once I got into college and I'd read about somebody who was doing something, I'd write them a letter and introduce myself, and some of them would invite me to contribute to their work. They were interested. Oh, I'd like to hear about prison. And that's who I would write to, academics and professors who wrote about the prison system. And that pathway really started to help me build my network. So the three things really worked together. Where getting an education made it easier for me to connect with professors, which made it easier for me to build a support network. And I'd start writing the stories of the people around me and telling the story. How did you get involved in crime? What motivated you? What have you learned from this experience? and it started sending out. And these professors invited me to publish chapters in their books, and then start writing for peer-reviewed journals. And then some of my mentors, they would come to visit me in prison, and these were some of the leading penologists in the world. And they would come to visit me in prison and work with me and allow me to write for them while I still had decades to serve in prison. But that process really helped me build momentum, and it gave me hope, and it made me believe that I'm executing this plan of preparing myself for what I want to do when I get out. So I got a great opportunity to publish with people that were some of the leading textbook authors who introduced me to their publishers. By the time I was in my, I would say, 10th year of imprisonment, I got invited to work closely with a guy by the name of Professor George Cole, who was the dean at the University of Connecticut and wrote one of the leading textbooks on criminal justice. And he suggested to me, why don't you write a book that would be similar, that would talk about your experience, so we could use it where my book is theory. You could write about what could we do better in the prison system. And that led to the first book that I wrote called About Prison. And About Prison was published by Wadsworth and was used in universities across the country. And then I reached out to another mentor who is Dr. Marilyn McShane, who is also an author, but on the editorial board of some academic publishers. And she invited me to write a book. And I said, well, I'd like to tell the story of people in prison. So I took those shorter pieces and turned it into a longer book that was called Profiles from Prison. And it told the story of people who were serving sentences of different lengths, from 5 years to 10 years to 20 years to more than 20 years. And I really wanted the world to know, what are they going through and what could we learn from them? And most importantly, what could we do to improve the prison system so more people come out successfully? Well, that strategy really was laying the groundwork for what I would do in going through prison, because it helped me build a broader support network and people that would be vested in kind of working with me. And I'll always remember one of the biggest influences it had on my life was around 2001, I think it was 2001 or 2002, when some student who, in some university, I don't even know who it was doing some research on me. And that was by then the internet had started, and it was easier for people to research. And he'd read about me in one of these books, and he was researching me, and he found out that I'd graduated from Shorecrest High School in North Seattle in 1982. So in 2001, they were getting ready to do the 20-year reunion for the class of 1982. And the woman that was coordinating it all, her name was Carol. This guy just wrote an unsolicited letter, said, is this the same Shorecrest where Michael Santos went? And Carol wrote him back and said, yes, why are you asking? And he said, oh, well, he's in prison and he's serving a long sentence, and I read about him in this book. And that prompted Carol to write me a letter. And the letter was, a nasty letter, I would say, but not the nasty kind of letter a guy in prison wants to get. It was rather, I'm a mother of 2 kids, drugs are bad. I always knew you were a bad kid. I can't believe you're in prison now. And she said, but we are having a 20-year reunion, and I'll send you some images or something. And I remember taking that letter and showing it to my friends in prison and said, she seems very angry with me. But I said, I'll bet you I can make her my girlfriend. And that was always a challenge, to do something that the prison said you couldn't do it. So I started writing her a letter and said, yes, I made a lot of really bad decisions when I was a kid, and I regret that now. But I'm not 20 anymore. I'm 35 or however old I was. And I've done this. I'm really trying to make a difference. And that led to a correspondence, and the correspondence led to a friendship. And the friendship eventually, after several months, about 10 months, she came to visit me in prison, and we fell in love inside of a federal prison's visiting room. And one of the greatest joys of my life is that on June 24th, 2003, she married me inside of a federal prison when I still had about 10 years to go. And when a woman comes into a guy's life in prison, the first thing is, I'm going to help get you out. And I'd say, I'm not getting out of prison. This is there's a war on drugs, and it's a bad system. And I've been working really hard to change that system and to position myself to build a career around that journey, because we incarcerate more people than any other nation on the planet. and it's a bad system. And my career is going to be about changing that system, but I'm not getting out. This won't happen. George Bush II was in the White House at that time, and there was still a lot of emphasis on the war on drugs. But let's build a life together. And so we did. And I had built this career in prison that was really fortunate. I'd started in high security penitentiaries. I never had a single altercation, even though I was there for 8 years. I went to a medium security prison, continued executing the plan that I'd put in place. I met Carol when I was in a low security prison. And we started developing a kind of unconventional family where she moved I was confined in New Jersey. She moved to New Jersey so that we could visit every day. And it was always this idea. I told her, I said, I'm going to find a way to work to change the system. But I still had 10 years to go. Fortunately, I had built income streams even while I was in prison from that publishing. And it allowed me to support Carol while we were in prison. And she decided to go back to school so that she could become a nurse. But the idea was always, on the other side of this, I want to build a meaningful career, and we're going to work together. But at the beginning, she was like my liaison to the world. So I would continuously write, and the world was changing. The internet had begun. So she helped me build a web page, and I'd start publishing even more than these earlier books. And I remember after she had relocated to New Jersey, we were in the visit one time, and I heard the guard say, "Santos, come up." And typically when that happens, it's because you're getting a little too close or a little too affectionate with your visitor. But I was experienced in prison, and I knew that system. I didn't touch her, so I go up to the officer, and he said, "Lieutenant wants to see you." And I said, there's never a good reason to be called a lieutenant's office in prison. So I go see the lieutenant, and I kind of know who he is. His name was Nesbitt. And Nesbitt says, "Do you know why you're here?" That's always the first question they ask in prison. And I said, "Yes, I know why I'm here." And he said, "What?" It's kind of surprised. And I said, "What was why you're here?" I said, 20 years ago or so, I sold cocaine, and ever since then, I've been going through this nonsense. And and he laughed because I had a relationship with him. And he said to me, "No," he said, "I'm sending you to a camp. You're going to a camp." And to put perspective, when you start in a high security penitentiary, a camp is like being home, minimum security. And I couldn't believe that I was going to a camp. I remember when they first met with me, they told me, "You'll never get out of a high security pen." But I'd gone after 7 or 8 years, went to a medium, spent a few years there. After 8 years in a low, now I'm going to a camp. And a camp means you're there on the honor system. There's not even a fence around it. And so I go to the camp, and now I've got a whole new stage of preparation to do, because this is now getting 10 years to somebody that's just going into the prison. That may seem like a long time, but for me, I'd already had 16 years of prison behind me, and 10 years didn't seem that long. So Carol, who had just moved to New Jersey, is now having to move around. And so she'd moved from New Jersey to where my first camp was in Colorado. And I get to Colorado, and now I want to, I'm in a different stage. I've already written books for the universities. Now I want to write a book for mainstream America. And I wrote a book called, I wanted to figure out how am I going to do that? Because I viewed all of this as part of advocacy. I had to build credibility, and being a published author, I believed, would build credibility. So since I'd published 2 books about prison and profiles from prison for an academic audience, I thought I would be ready to write for the mainstream. So I learned that I had to get an agent. So I started writing letters to agents in the same way that I wrote letters to schools, and told them my story. I wrote a couple sample chapters. I wanted to write a book that was equivalent to a book that inspired me by Alexander Solzhenitsyn called The Gulag Archipelago, which would tell the story of the entire American prison system. But it's a huge book. It's like an Old Testament size book. It's 1,000 pages or 1,500 pages. And the agents wrote me back and said, nobody's going to read that much about prison. You need to slim it down. And so I agreed, and I wrote a sample chapter. And fortunately, an agent got me a deal with St. Martin's Press in 2004, I think it was, or 2005, for a book that was called Inside: Life Behind Bars in America. And it was a really portrayal that I would say is 85% about what I saw and experienced, and maybe 15% about my own journey. And it was reviewed in the LA Times Book Review and the New York Times Book Review, so it got a lot of media. And as a result, I would get transferred to other prisons. So first I'd go to the solitary confinement, again, because you're not supposed to be publishing from prison. And I remember getting transferred from there to Lompoc, from Colorado to Lompoc here in California. And it had been 17 years it took me before I got to Lompoc. So I was on the East Coast the first 17 years of my sentence before I could come back to the West Coast, which was home for me. So I was very happy to come to Lompoc, but I remember being in the hole and a captain there. The captain is the head of security, came to see me and said, "We know that you're an author or that you've written. I don't want you to write in this prison or we'll lock you in solitary again." And Carol, my wife, was already in nursing school in Santa Barbara. And she told me, she said, "Look, just don't publish anything until I graduate from nursing school. And because I don't want to get transferred again," because she would always move from the prison wherever I was. So I agreed not to publish anything. And then she got her first nursing degree and I started writing again. And of course I went to the hole. And when I went to the hole, the captain came to see me and said, "I told you not to publish from here and I'm going to keep you in the hole. And you can't write books from prison." And I said, "Well, evidently you can write books from prison. That's why I'm here." But he locked me in the hole, and I had to, litigate my way out. And I did. I did this thing called administrative remedy, and I had prevailed, and I won the disciplinary infraction. And he came to see me again. He said, "Well, I still don't want you here." His name was Andy, and I bring his name up because later he proved to have an influential role in the work that I do now. So he said, "I'm still going to ship you, even though you won the disciplinary infraction, I'm going to ship you to another prison." I went to a prison in Bakersfield, another camp. It was called Taft. It was a contract facility, so it wasn't even part of the Bureau of Prisons, but it was where they sent some people in federal prison. And I had a great experience there where I wrote quite a few other books and started to build this pathway for the life that I wanted to lead when I got out of prison. And toward the end of my journey, it's 2011, I didn't know, because I was sentenced under the old law, I never really knew when I would get out. I just had a range because they had this thing called the U.S. Parole Commission back then. So I knew that I would potentially serve somewhere between 24 years, 23 years, and 26 years. And when I got to my 25th year, it was very close. So they said, "We've got to send you to a place where the parole commission can meet you because they don't come to this non-federal facility." So they sent me to Atwater in Northern California in 2011. And when I got there, they looked at all the things that I'd done in prison. They said, "Look, if you stay here, we can get you to the parole commission, or we can give you a date right now if you will agree to serve your last year in the halfway house." And I said, "I'm ready. Let me go to the halfway house." So that was in 2000. They said, "Your release date is August the 13th, 2012. It was a Monday. And I had a few months to prepare before I got there. And I remember my wife came to pick me up, and it was the first time in 10 years of marriage that I'd ever been with her outside of a visiting room setting. And it was just so magical for me to be able to embrace her and kiss her for the first time without officers. But I didn't have a lot of time because I had to be at the halfway house in San Francisco within 3 hours. And if I didn't get to the halfway house within 3 hours, I know the prison system, they'll give you a disciplinary infraction. It just means you can't go for home passes later. So we both knew we had to get to the halfway house. So got in the car, she had a pizza waiting for me. It was the main thing I wanted, was a pepperoni pizza. And we just started driving to San Francisco. And she'd given me this contraption that some of you may know, it's called an iPhone. And I'll always remember, I'd never been on the internet. I'd been reading about it. And I was so fascinated by the internet. I'd been very active with both universities and with technology from what I'd studied in prison, but I'd never used it. So it's kind of like reading about tennis. That doesn't make you a good tennis player. And she gave me the phone. And I still remember putting it to my phone. I said, this one's broken there because there's no dial tone. And she showed me how to work it. And I said, well, how do I get on the internet? What's the internet? I want to get on the internet. I was so excited. And she kind of showed me, and I was playing with it while she was driving me to San Francisco. And I remember when we came across the Oakland Bridge coming into the bay, because I had to go to the Tenderloin halfway house, and I saw those buildings, and I got so excited. I said, this is where I'm going to build my life. And I was 49 years old, and I remember telling her, I'm going to make an impact now. I'm excited about what I'm going to do. And I get to the halfway house and have to go through that whole rigmarole. But I don't know, I don't have anything, right? I'd been in prison for a long time, and I have to build everything. But I'd had these plans that really helped me through. So my adjustment was different, I think, from a lot of people that served multiple decades in prison, and that I had a substantial amount of money in the bank from my writing and from other work that I had done. And I had a wife, and I had a massive support system, bigger than I even knew. And but I just didn't know how to navigate the world. And I had to get a driver's license because I didn't have anything like that. So it took a couple of days. I think I got there on a Monday. By Wednesday, the case manager allowed me to go to the DMV on Fell Street in San Francisco. And my friend, a guy I met in prison, I'm calling him on the phone because I have no idea how to navigate the streets of San Francisco. And he's using these maps and telling me, okay, turn left here, turn right there. I eventually get to the DMV and I get my driver's license. But I can assure you, you didn't want to be on the road with me. I didn't know that I forgot how to drive. I don't know when I forgot how to drive. You'd think you never will forget how to drive. But when you're in prison for 25 years, and it was 25 years in prison, I did the last year and a half at house. When you're in prison for 25 years, you never move faster than your legs can carry you. And so your eyes adjust. And when you're outside, everything's moving so fast. So I had studied the DMV test, so I knew how to pass the written test. But when I got behind the wheel of a car, I knew I don't know how to drive, and it took me some time to learn and get comfortable. I think, and that was the funny thing, is it took several months before I became comfortable as a driver, even though I had my driver's license. So I'm learning this path, and I'm in the halfway house and going through these stages. And I think it was the first week that I get a call from the editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, who said, we've been following your story, because I'd had this website where I was writing and publishing about prison all the time. I'd just write by hand. I'd send it to my wife, and she would publish it. And I'd been doing that ever since she came into my life. So I'd built a pretty big following of people that were interested in prisons. And the editor wrote me, said, we've been following your story for a long time, and now that you're back in the San Francisco, would you allow us to cover your story? I said, love to. So he does this story that came out on Thanksgiving weekend of November 2012. And I think it was the next Monday I get a call, start getting calls from universities that are inviting me to come and speak there. And I was super excited because up until that moment, I'd never stepped foot on a university campus in my life. The universities had a huge role on my adjustment, but I never went to school before prison. And now I'm getting these calls from universities, and I had relationships with people at Stanford and Berkeley and other areas in the Bay Area that had published with me, and now they're inviting me to come. And I remember the first place I went was San Francisco State University. That was the first campus I stepped foot on. And I give this presentation, much like I'm giving right here, talking about the prison experience. And by then I'd written this book called Earning Freedom, which is really this whole concept that my career is around. And I'm telling the story, and after I finish it, and I'm only speaking to the criminal justice staff. So there's like 5 people, I think, in the room. And they said afterwards, they said, well, would you like a job? And this is when I just gotten out of prison. And I said, what is it that you want me to do, here? I think they want me to do maintenance. He said, well, we'd like you to be a professor. And I said, so that's all a guy's got to do is go to prison for multiple decades and he becomes a professor? And this is the key point that I try to tell people who are living in jails or prisons or struggle. And he said, no. He said, when I was in grad school, we had to read your books. And so I've known about you for 10 years. And when I read the story in the newspaper, that's why I reached out. But we'd love for you to teach here. And I said, what do you want me to teach? I said, teach anything you want. So I decided to teach, I wrote this course called The Architecture of Incarceration. And it was this story of how Western civilization has responded to lawbreakers historically over time, from the medieval times to today. And I wanted students, it was part of this advocacy effort that I make. And this is back in 2013, 12, 13, that era. And I wanted to help students understand we could do better, because what prisons really do is they perpetuate these intergenerational cycles of failure and just keep recidivism rates growing. And I wanted to change it. And the way that I believed that we could change it is by making it more like America, where you incentivize people who are doing well instead of just measuring justice through the number of calendar pages that turn. And they were receptive to that. And I use that story today to try and change the system. And through that professorship, I had more opportunities to advocate for change. And I published an article in the UC Hastings Law Journal called Incentivizing Excellence. So it was really calling for ways that we could change America's prison system. And at that time, it was unheard of for anybody to be talking about anything other than locking people in prison for multiple decades if they broke the law. You know, it was a tough on crime era. But we incarcerated more people than any other nation. And I think it's really bad for America. And so I would publish about this, and it led to me getting speaking engagements for judicial conferences and, any place. And I would go and speak anywhere that I could, because I knew I needed to get an audience, and I needed to help people see something different. And I got this invitation to speak at a judicial conference for the Ninth Circuit, where there were 1,000 people there, federal judges and prison officials from all states in the Western United States, and U.S. attorneys and I gave a keynote speech that's very similar to what I'm talking about right now. And I would get these calls from the audience in the Q&A that not everybody can do what you did. And I would say, well, you'll say that to me now, when you see me now after I've got the time before me. But let's not forget what the system said when I went into the system, that I should be in there for 300 years and still justice would not be served. I said, the reality is that anybody can transform their life, but I need your help, because I'm a guy that just got out of prison, and I need more influential people helping me spread that message. And it was a great opportunity that I got to scale, start visiting prisons. In fact, one of the guys that came up to me afterwards, I'll always remember, was wearing a blue suit, and he came to me and he shook my hand. He said, "Do you remember me?" And I said, "Of course I remember. You're Andy Matavusian. You locked me in the hole back at Lompoc for doing what these judges asked me to do." And he laughed and he said, "Well, I really like what you're doing now, and I'm now a warden, and I'd love for you to come to my prison and give this presentation to the men." I said, I could go and give a presentation and it'll last, an hour or 2 hours, and it'll be very motivational, but that's not going to move the needle. I said, why don't you let me build a program and bring it into the prison? And he said, my prison's a really violent prison. It's a lot of gang related. He said, if you could help me lower the level of violence, great, we'll pilot the program there and then try and grow. And so we did, and it was really successful. And why? Not because I'm a great teacher, but people could identify with somebody that did a quarter century, and it gave them hope. It helped them see that they could be something more. And it's kind of funny, because I would go into the prison. My program is all digital and video, and so I speak in a camera, and I try and give this story. But I will also go into prisons, and when I go in there, the first thing they'll say is, "That fool was never in prison," And I'll say, "See, you think you're giving me an insult because I don't look hard enough, and I might not speak as if I was in prison for 26 years, but I always say, I got a little secret. That was the plan. The plan was to come back to society and have nobody know that you served a day in prison, and that's what I want for everybody here." And that led to the program spreading, because I could always make them 3 promises. It was 1, I'm never going to lie to you. And 2, I'm never going to ask you to do something I didn't do. And 3, I'm never going to ask you to pay me a penny. Nobody has to pay me anything. And that would help me build credibility with the people and help them build hope in themselves. And they start to see, maybe I can do this, and I know that they can do this. And then, the warden it was at the high security penitentiary in Atwater. He got promoted to be the warden in Colorado, which was the nation's supermax, and another high security prison. And he called me and said, could you bring the program to Colorado? And I said, for sure. So we're going to Colorado, and we introduced it there, and it was really well received, and by the people serving time. And then he got promoted again, and now he's a regional director, one of 6 in the Bureau of Prison. He said, I want you now to come to my region. And so I brought it to every prison in the North Central region. This program is called Preparing for Success After Prison. And then we got it approved as a nationwide program. And now this program influences 1 million people, not only through my direct relationship with prisons, but also through collaborations I make with other nonprofits, including the Adovo Foundation, where we reach 1 million people who don't have access to the internet, but they have access to these digital programs that we bring into prison. And the program is really just about helping people see that you can't wait for the government or the prison system to change your life. The prison system is the prison system, and it's going to do what the prison system does. But it's super important to help these people see. And I don't use the word inmate or convict or prisoner. They're people. And I believe in people. And I remember when I was in prison, they'd say, what are you, an inmate or a convict? And I'd say, I'm an American. I'm a man. And I want to change my life, and everybody should be able to do that. And that's what I try to convey to the people. I said, regardless of what the system does, what can you do? And any person in prison can do what Frederick Douglass did. That person can work to get an education. They can work to write better, speak better, develop critical thinking skills, develop a self-directed work ethic. And anybody who does that is going to put himself in a better position to succeed and to build a life. And that's really what I feel my role is to become an ambassador of that message that I learned from Nelson Mandela or Frederick Douglass or Viktor Frankl or all of these people who inspired me through the journey, and share it and just put what I learned from them into the context of 2025 and help people start to believe in themselves. Because there's too much of a message in prison that you're supposed to adjust in a certain way. And unfortunately, that way frequently leads to homelessness, and it leads to further problems with the law, to unemployment or underemployment. And that's really something I feel very passionately about wanting to change. And I need other people to help me. So I go into prisons frequently and give this message, not only through my videos of prison professors, but also in person. And that strategy is what I believe will help me convince Americans that we should change America's prison system, so that we shouldn't be proud of locking up more people than any other nation on the planet. We should be thinking about, what can we do better? What can we do to help people reach their highest potential? And that's what really all of our messaging is about. And I'm super enthusiastic that I get to do it. But I sometimes when you go into prisons, the people will say, I'm going through your program and I'm really appreciative of what you're doing, but I've got 20 years and I finished your program in 100 hours. What else can you do? And I said, well, if you've gone through the program, theoretically, you should know what to do, because that's what I teach. You've got to be self-directed. I can't change your life. I can only show you what I learned from Mandela. How did that change mine? And I believe it will change yours. But it always bothered me that, these are serving long times, and I wanted to do more. And I got super inspired by Brian Chesky, the founder and CEO of Airbnb. And I was listening to a podcast. I like to listen to podcasts. It's one of the reasons I'm familiar with Soft Bite Underbelly. And I listen to podcasts and I learn from people. And a really great question somebody asked him was, what was the hardest thing you had to do in building your company? And he said the hardest thing was during the COVID pandemic. He said, I had to lay off 2,800 people. And when I had to lay off 2,800 people, these were my family. These were people that helped me build the company, and it hurt, but I have a responsibility to shareholders, and I had to let them go. And so I built this section of the site called Airbnb.com/talent, where I profiled every person that I was laying off, and I spoke about their skill and about the role they had in helping us build a great company. And I encouraged other people to hire them. And that inspired me so much that I said, that's something I can do, because I had already become successful in business, and it wasn't any longer for me to work for money. It became about making an impact. And I launched prisonprofessorstalent.com, which is free for anybody who's in custody, anybody who's in jail. And what I encourage them to do is memorialize your journey, because you're being shut off. In America, we like to point accusatory fingers at other nations and talk about how they're violating human rights. But I think if we ask any American, what is a human right? The answer is, freedom of speech, freedom to communicate, freedom to improve your life. Well, every day we're violating the human rights of millions of people who don't know how to function in society because they're locked in prisons. They're going to pick up iPhones and not know what to do with them. They're not going to know how to use the tools of technology because they're locked in this world that blocks them. And it leads to intergenerational cycles of failure. So I decided to build Prison Professors Talent, where we encourage people, write your own biography. Don't allow the Department of Justice to define who you are. Tell us who you are. And what did you learn from this experience? Because other people are going to want to know. 2, every time you read a book, you should learn something from that book, and you should write a report. Why did I read this book? What did I learn from reading this book? How is reading this book going to contribute to my success upon release? 4, you should write a daily journal. Tell me what you're doing and why it's going to relate to what you want to become. And finally, build your own release plan. And if you memorialize this journey of your time in prison, you're going to find other people who will help you, just as I did. You might find a woman to marry you. You might find a publisher to give you a publishing deal. You might find an employer who says, I want you to be a part of my team. And that is the way that I try to scale this message to reach not only people in prison, but also people out here, which is why I'm super grateful for every opportunity I have to be able to share my story. And Mark, it's one of the reasons I'm super grateful to you for allowing me to share it with your incredible audience. So that's the story that I have.
Incredible. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
You know your subject very well, don't you?
It's what I live, and I've been out for 12 years, but I still live it every day. And yeah, every day is an opportunity to try and spread it to other people.
Amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
When I was designing the first Soft-White Underbelly book, I realized that there were so many great portraits that weren't going to make it into that book. They just wouldn't fit. And once I saw how well that first book sold, I knew I'd have to design a second book. This second book is finally ready to ship. Like the first one, this book has a collection of some of the best portraits from Soft-White Underbelly, accompanied by a quote from that person's interview. This book features another group of Rebecca portraits, as well as a collection of color images of the Whitaker family, and plenty of others. You can order yours for $125 or $150 for a signed copy at softwhiteunderbelly.org. Again, like the first book, once this book is sold out, I will not be printing more of them. The portraits are what Soft-White Underbelly is all about, and these 2 books contain the best of all that work. Thank you for watching.